Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about a Dark Eldar unit that I think has gone under the radar for long enough. And that unit is, of course, Reavers. So Reavers are a unit that historically has been pretty good. They've never really been terrible, to my memory. In 5th edition, when the Dark Eldar got a big revamp, Reavers were, one of the best units in that book, in my humble opinion. And then as the editions went on, they were still pretty solid. In 9th edition, they were an extremely powerful unit that was really fast and could deal a significant amount of damage in melee. However, when 10th edition came around, they kind of took a hit to their melee ability. They definitely lost quite a bit of punch in close combat, that's without a doubt. However, what they did maintain was their incredibly high movement speed, and it is that movement speed that's going to allow them to actually do quite a bit of work in 10th edition. And so in today's video, we're going to shine a light on a very hidden gem within the Dark Eldar Index that I think people are definitely overlooking. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into it. So in today's video, specifically, we are going to go into the stats, weapons, and special rules of the Reavers. We're going to be talking about their strengths and weaknesses, combos and synergies, and lastly, the role Reavers play in a Dark Eldar or Ynnari army, and how to make the most out of them. So looking at their basic stat line, they are one of the fastest units in the entire game with movement 16. Most Eldar stuff caps out at movement 14. So having that 2 extra inches may not seem like a big deal, but it actually is. It does allow them to, transverse and score on secondaries that, craft-rolled Eldar units wouldn't be able to do without help. They also are very fragile as a result. They only have a 4+ save versus a 3+ save of regular jet bikes, and only have a 6+ invul save, which rarely comes into play. They are OC2, just like all mounted units, which is pretty standard, and they are toughness 4 and have 2 wounds apiece. As far as their ranged weapons go, they can take either a blaster or heat lance for every 3 bikes. The heat lance melts large targets at close range with insane strength 14 and really high armor piercing values at -4. It also, of course, has melt of 3, which is pretty good, and the assault keyword. The blaster is the safer pick, though, because it doesn't have to get so close to do damage, but it also just doesn't do as much damage and doesn't have the high strength that the heat lance does. So strength 8 is considerably lower. But to make up for that a little bit, it does have +1 damage over the heat lance. At long range, that is. As far as their other ranged weapons, they do have splinter pistols, and they also have splinter rifles underslung on their jet bikes. So, there's nothing much to be said about these. They're pretty decent anti-infantry weapons with assault, but they're nothing to write home about. You might be lucky to ping a wound off of a Space Marine with these, but not much more. As far as their melee ability goes, the Arena Champion can be armed with the Agonizer, which is a good anti-infantry weapon, has a little bit of AP, anti-infantry 3+, 4 attacks. It's pretty decent. It's nothing to write home about, though. The other models are armed with the Blade Veins, which actually kind of suck. They're only strength 4, AP 0. If you compare them to Windrider jet bikes have strength 3. These guys have strength 4. So they're a little better in combat, but not by much. As far as their abilities go, they have Eviscerating Flyby, which causes mortal wounds to a unit they move over on a 4+ per model in the Reavers unit. So if you have 3 Reavers moving over an enemy unit, you're going to roll 3d6, and for each 4+, that enemy suffers a mortal wound. So this isn't really good for killing large units, but it is good for dealing precision damage against things like lone operatives and, finishing off enemy units. However, do keep in mind that it doesn't affect vehicles and monsters, so you can't, actually use this on those bigger targets. As far as their war gear abilities go, you can either take the Cluster Caltrops, which allow you to reroll 1 dice on your mortal wound ability, or the Grav Talon, which gives the model the Lance ability. So that's +1 to wound on charge. Now, neither of these is that great. I tend to, kind of steer more towards the Cluster Caltrops because I like to, know that if I'm going to use an Eviscerating Flyby, that I can at least pick up 1 Space Marine with a unit of 3. However, the Grav Talon is the more popular choice because, giving the Lance ability to one of the models in your unit does make them a little tiny bit harder hitting in close combat, but I've often found it's just not good enough to actually make the unit decent in close combat. So I typically just steer towards the Cluster Caltrops. That way, I can at least guarantee a couple of mortal wounds on an enemy unit that I fly over. As far as their war gear options go, the Arena Champ can be armed with an Agonizer. One model per 3 can be armed with the Grav Talon or Cluster Caltrop. One model in 3 can take a Heat Lance or Blaster. And lastly, all upgrades should only be put on the Arena Champ, right? You don't want to spread the upgrades around, because then that way if you do lose a model, you're losing that upgrade. Whereas if you put it all on the Champion, you're not going to lose all those upgrades until the last model dies. And as far as their unit composition goes, they can be taken in a unit of 3 for 70 points or 6 for 140 points. So they're pretty cheap. 70 points for 3 of them is pretty much a budget option as far as a secondary objective score goes. That puts them 10 points below things like Wind Riders and Shroud Runners, and it allows them to keep a low profile. And while it may be tempting to run 6 of these for extra eviscerating flybys, there is really no advantage to having a unit of 6 over just simply 2 units of 3, because you're probably going to have better targets for Power from Pain or your other buffs accordingly. So, running these guys as a 3-man is probably the way to go. As far as their keywords go, they have the Mounted and Fly keywords, making it a bit more difficult to move through ruins, but again, they do have a faster speed, so we're able to do this a little bit better. They also have the Witch Cult keyword, so it can be targeted by Acrobatic Display, which is a Witch Cult specific stratagem which allows them to advance or fall back and charge in the same turn. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about their strengths and weaknesses. As far as their strengths go, they're extremely fast, especially with stratagem support. So you give these guys Fire and Fade or Strike and Fade, and yeah, it is, significant amount of command points, but they can clear one side of the board to the other and score on a key secondary objective or get to a key position in the board that you need them to be to threaten an enemy unit. And yes, these guys aren't super great at killing enemy units, but there are a few types of units that they can kill pretty easily, which I'll talk about later in this video. They also have decent anti-large damage with the Heat Lance and have assault weapons so they can advance and shoot, which is very important. Their weaknesses, however, are they are extremely fragile. They die to indirect fire pretty much super easily. A Basilisk pretty much is able to put them in the garbage can in a single round of shooting, which is pretty unfortunate, and it means they don't really compare well to things like Eldar jet bikes and Shroud Runners as far as their survivability against indirect fire. Shroud Runners, it'll take probably 2 to maybe 3 Basilisks to be able to put them down. However, with Reavers, it might only take 1. They are also a pretty mediocre close combat unit, and they have a very situational ability. So unlike other jet bike units, like, Wind Riders and Shroud Runners, who have a great ability that has a lot of applications, their ability is a little bit more situational and really only comes into play a couple times per game. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about their strengths and weaknesses a little bit, I do want to talk to you guys about the combos and synergies that these guys can pull off. So first of all, Fire or Strike and Fade can get them from board edge to board edge in a single turn to score key secondaries. This is really important, especially as a Dark Eldar player. You have to leverage your speed to your advantage, right? You don't necessarily have the survivability to hold primary objectives. In fact, you just don't. There's a couple of units in your army that might be able to do it, like the Kronos and Talos, but they're still pretty fragile when compared to other units in other indexes. And durable for the cost doesn't always mean durable enough to survive on a center objective for more than a couple turns. So you do have to use your speed, and Reavers are one of the fastest, if not the fastest, units in the index, aside from Flyers. Acrobatic Display allows them to charge after advancing, giving them a massive threat range as well. 16 inches of movement plus D6 advance, which they can reroll, by the way, because of the Power from Pain. And a 2d6 charge roll, which they can again reroll because of Power from Pain. They can threaten things from really across the board, so your opponent can't really leave any units isolated or vulnerable. The Heat Lance with a reroll to hit and wound in a Yunari list make the unit a big threat against heavy targets up close as well, and even in a Dark Eldar list, being able to reroll a single hit on the first turn with a power token or a Power from Pain token is a pretty good way of getting some cheeky damage on a heavy target. And in my experience, an opponent will rarely want to waste an Overwatch on a unit of Reavers just because they're kind of cheap, and chances are, even with the Overwatch, unless it's an extremely powerful Overwatch, They're going to kill the 2 other Reavers with the Splinter Rifles, and the Heat Lance one is still going to be alive, threatening the opponent's vehicle. So basically a waste of a command point. Alright, so let's kind of go into this further, and I want to tell you guys a few cool tricks you can do with Reavers that will throw your opponent off. So the first trick is to do a turn 1 charge with Acrobatic Display to tie up a shooting unit or clog a movement lane. So this is a 16-inch movement plus a d6 advance plus a 2d6 charge range, which can be empowered with rerolls on the advance roll and the charge roll if needed. So obviously this can really throw an opponent off because most opponents, if you don't have something that's infiltrating or using a scout move, aren't going to expect you to be able to charge from your deployment zone to their deployment zone, right? They're probably going to expect things like mandrakes to be able to charge, maybe even a Beastmaster and a Beast Pack if you've brought one, but they're not going to expect Reavers from your own deployment zone to be able to reach theirs. However, with this combination, you definitely can do it, and they are a Witch Cult unit, so they can use Acrobatic Display. Okay, so that's trick number 1. Trick number 2 is getting them into the enemy's deployment zone if you go second with the Fire or Strike and Fade to score on deploy teleport homers or engage on all fronts. And again, because these guys aren't actually deep striking, they're not swooping hawks or mandrakes that your opponent can screen out. So your opponent is not going to expect this unit to be able to do that. Or if they do, there's just really not much they can do to stop it. Unless they have a unit of like Infernus Marines or something like that that is going to camp in their own backfield all game and just sit there, in which case it's a win-win for you because then their Flamers and Overwatch units aren't in the midboard and you can kind of play to that accordingly. And it's kind of insane to think that a single unit of Reavers, which only costs 70 points, can control the opponent's movements in that way. And also just, make your opponent waste a bunch of resources trying to stop them if they do. So oftentimes an experienced opponent will just let you do it. And in that case, it's a win for you because you get to score those extra secondaries. And of course, you can use your mandrakes and other deep striking units in other spots of the battlefield. And now the last thing that you should always be looking for, especially in competitive play, is their ability to assassinate lone operatives. A lone op with a 12-inch bubble is very vulnerable to a fast unit like this. Because not only do you have a Heat Lance, which can pretty much go right through armor and hit straight to an invul save, but they can also follow up with a charge, which can be extremely powerful. So in cases where your opponent has a 4-up invul or something like that, they can always follow up with a charge. They have anti-infantry with the Agonizer, and chances are they are going to be able to kill that unit through sheer weight of dice. And even things like a Solitaire are not really that safe against a unit of these guys. So first of all, your opponent is going to have to spend a fate dice trying to save the Solitaire from the Heat Lance. They're really not going to want to risk rolling a 1 or a 2. And then on top of that, you have 2 Splinter Rifles, which do wound on 3+ and hit on 3+. And you have Blade Vein attacks as well as the Agonizer, which also, quite frankly, against squishy lone operatives that Eldar have, hit on 3+ and wound on 3+, with rerolls if you choose to empower it. So that Solitaire, Death Jester, or perhaps even that Autarch Wayleaper are going to be in a really tight spot and most likely are going to either die or be, beaten within an inch of their life. But most likely are going to die just through sheer weight of dice. But here's the thing, even if those models end up surviving, your opponent is going to have to waste a lot of resources trying to stop you. And these guys aren't just good against Eldar lone operatives, they're good against a lot of lone operatives that you will commonly see in competitive play. Alright, so what are the role of Reavers in a Dark Eldar or Ynnari army, and how do you make the most out of them? So Reavers are a flexible secondary objective unit and trading piece that can punch up against tough targets or quickly dispatch an isolated lone op. For 70 points, they can be an excellent disruption unit as well to pin enemies in place and block movement lanes, which your opponent will obviously have to move through to get to objectives. And of course, as a Dark Eldar or Ynnari player, the longer you can keep enemy units off of objectives and scoring primaries, the better chances you have of winning the game and controlling the battlefield. They are also a great Overwatch bait, as only the arena champion is valuable in the unit. The whole unit is expendable, but the 2 Reavers with the the Splinter Rifles are even more expendable. The Arena Champ is really the one you're going to have all the upgrades on anyway, so, it's really the only important piece in the unit. And something for you Ynnari players out there who've been listening to this video and probably waiting for this moment, the Reavers are really good with Ynnari. First of all, they play into the MSU playstyle that the Ynnari like to be in because of the Yncarne's ability to teleport. And because of this unit's extreme speed, they can get to places in the battlefield that are going to be inconvenient for your opponent big time, especially if you have the Yncarne that's going to be teleporting right to the spot that the Reavers are in. So it kind of creates a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for your opponent, who now either has to waste a bunch of resources killing the Reavers, which could potentially mean that the Yncarne pops up in their backfield, or they can just simply ignore the Reavers, but that also has consequences because now you can freely score secondaries and also threaten the opponent's backline units, which over the course of the game can actually hurt your opponent much more than the Yncarne coming in the backfield in the first place. Alright, so in conclusion, Reavers are definitely an overlooked unit due to their subpar melee performance and fragility. However, they are an excellent objective unit with some insane utility and tricks up their sleeve. And they can basically get to places and threaten units that the other objective scorers in your army just can't. Units like Mandrakes, for example, with their essentially Skyleap ability, just can't get to certain places of the battlefield if your opponent screens it effectively. But Reavers, on the other hand, do not care about screening because not only do they have fly, but they don't really have to come in from reserve, so they don't have to worry about that, 9-inch bubble of screening that deep strike units have to worry about. So essentially, yeah, even though they do compete with Mandrakes for that secondary objective unit, they can do things that Mandrakes can't, which makes them a really valuable unit to have in your army. And, in my humble opinion, I think every Dark Eldar army should consider using at least one squad of Reavers for that exact purpose. And especially in competitive play, people are learning how to deal with Swooping Hawks, right? They're seeing Skyleap being used more and more. They're finding out ways to stop it. So, same with Mandrakes, right? Mandrakes have basically the same ability. If an opponent knows how to stop Swooping Hawks, they know how to stop Mandrakes. But if you have a unit of Reavers, your opponent is going to either have to spend a ton of resources trying to screen them out with strong Overwatch type units, or they're just going to have to let you score your secondary objectives. Either way, it's a win for you at the low cost of 70 points. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Tell me what you guys think of Reavers in the comments. I know there's some Dark Eldar players who follow the content on my channel. Definitely let me know in the comments. I've run them both in Ynnari and Dark Eldar, and they've done very well in both. So I'm definitely looking forward to hearing your thoughts about them. Once again, thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters who have helped support the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to become a Patreon member and help support the channel, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course hobbying, and I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel on my channel store page, or you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will also leave the links for that in the description. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.